Yes, thank you very much. And thank you all very much for this invitation and the opportunity to moderate this panel. I think I have an enlightened group of people here, and I'm not going to do a lot of the talking because it's their voices you want to hear. But from the conversations that we've had today, we see that we have a significant funding gap. And I think Jennifer sort of gave us the numbers, 6 trillion in terms of the funding gap to fund the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, but then very expensive goals, especially in countries like ours, emerging markets and developing economies that still have various gaps like inclusion and different societal development gaps in general. But then we also know that the current funding mechanisms we have are insufficient. I think in the case of Nigeria, our annual 2018 budget alone cannot even fund education. So if we're going to address these challenges, we need to be a bit more creative in the financing options, and we need to have different modalities and different structures and approaches that would work towards ensuring that every mom and pop or everybody who whether you're in microfinance or you're a large business can access financing to ensure that we're contributing positively towards addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And so what we're trying to get from my panel here is, how do we get blended finance to work in a country like Nigeria? How do we ensure that we can prepare both from the supply side, because, and I like the way my panelists have sat. It's not, they did it by themselves, but these two are more of the supply side, and these two are more of the demand side, okay? So, and then what we want to do today is have the conversation, and building on what the other panel had brought out, and then also open it up for questions and answers to the audience, because I see that my audience is really looking at how do we go about it? How do we go about accessing some of these mechanisms and tools in general? So we'll open that up for questions and answers. So I'm going to jump right in and first ask my panelists in their own words, right, to introduce themselves and why they're here. So I'll start with Jennifer, just in your own words again, not what we read or heard earlier on.
You bet. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'll be brief. Why I'm here is really to share what we've learned over our 25 years, but in particular in bringing private capital into these transactions. So that piece of how the capital moves from private investors to communities, that link from the private capital, bringing them into the funds, into the intermediaries, into the blended finance transactions.
Thank you. My name is Usanase, and I work for Africa Finance Corporation. Maybe in a quick word for some of you who are not familiar with the institution, is the DFI that finance infrastructure on the continent. We're presently in about 28 countries and focusing on large projects in the power sector, transport, natural resources, and heavy networks and telecom. And being an institution that was created also as a PPP framework and actually as also a blended finance structure, I would like to share that experience with you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Guy-Bertrand Njoya. I'm the CFO of Max, as indicated earlier. So I think we all know a little bit about Max. Max is a two- and three-wheel mobility platform. That is basically what we're doing is we're building what we call the technology and financial infrastructure to solve the challenges of mobility in urban settings across Africa. So what does that mean? It means that in order to make our transportation and mobility systems more efficient, based on our observation of the space, we realize that there are a key area across the value chain that need to be solved. One of which is, for instance, access to finance for the operator. Another one is leveraging on technology to make it run more efficiently. Why are we here? Why am I here? Because we were approached by the Impact Investor Foundation to participate. And at Max, we have a rule. So we go to a few of these events, and we notice that more often than not, the supply side is very well represented, is always represented, and the demand side is rarely ever represented. So our requests to those event organizers is that the only way we participate is if we can actually sort of like speak, you know, from our own perspective, right? So that the voice from this side can be heard a little bit more. That's why we're here.
Thank you, Guy. Kola.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kola, and I'm the founding partner of Ventures Platform. We are an early-stage fund. We invest and take minority stakes in innovative startups at the earliest stage of their development, and then we partner with them, helping them scale and raise follow-on capital. We're invested across about 30 companies across different verticals, from ag tech to fintech and health tech as well. And I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Thank you all very much. So I'm going to go back to my supply side ladies here, and I want to ask the question of when is blended finance appropriate? In other words, when do we use blended finance as an option? And then I would like you to sort of provide this from using examples that are more practicable and understanding to the audience. So I'll start with you, Jenny.
Sure. So when to use blended finance? And I really think Emmy hit this on the head earlier with her comment around looking for a solution. This is one of the tools in the toolkit to address structural breaks in the system, so to speak. I think of it in the terms of pipes, that money needs pipes to move. And moving money from one pocket into another, if there's a broken pipe, it will fall out. And what blended finance is doing is really connecting or strengthening that pipe. And so, when to use it, I think it was said before, but I'll reiterate if that's the case, is when you can see that there's the opportunity to bring that market, that asset, to scale. If it's a one-off transaction, just to get money out of one pocket into the other, I don't believe that's where blended finance should be used. When there's an opportunity to show that money can move from one pocket to another, to demonstrate, and to show that that community, that asset is investable, then blended finance is great. Because what it's doing is it's almost a teaching tool. It's showing how to invest in that asset, and that asset is investable. And what blended finance does is simply decrease the perceived risk and create the right risk-adjusted return, both for the investor and both to get the right cost of capital into that business. So again, not every nail needs a hammer, so to speak. Blended finance doesn't work in every transaction, but it's a very effective tool in some.
So great. I think one thing we need to bear in mind is that it's not an all-comers market. The problem or the project you're addressing must have some element of scalability in it. And then it gives you some low-cost way to start up and scale, and then you go into the growth stage. But the opportunity must be evident from day zero. Okay, so Alice, why don't you chime in?
Just maybe to speak in a more straightforward way from an investor perspective. Usually the reason we use blended finance, especially in the infrastructure sector, is just to improve the risk profile, the risk return profile of the transaction we're looking at. And most of the time, these are transactions like in the power sector, which we all know that they are necessary, but most of the time they're actually not financially viable. We also use blended finance in the transport sector. And one good example, for example, is the Henry Konabedier Bridge in Abidjan, for some of who have been to Côte d'Ivoire. It was a transaction that had been in talks for about almost 20 years. However, it could not get financial close because a case could not be showed that there was enough traffic for that bridge to be there. So AFC stepped in, I think, in 2014, and brought in the right stakeholders, which actually I think is one point you mentioned. You need to be able to bring the right parties on the table. We brought in the Africa Development Bank and Buick, which is an engineering construction French company. And you also worked with the government of Côte d'Ivoire. And what the government of Côte d'Ivoire, as a public institution, they provided a traffic guarantee to be able to provide comfort to institutions like ADB, AFC, or even the sponsor, the construction company. So the traffic guarantee, the way it works is just basically say that if there's not enough revenue to service the debt as provided the financial institution, then the government steps in and provide that remaining gap of revenue. And the case to be proved in the last 5 years, we haven't actually got to use that traffic guarantee, but at least it was used as a tool to be able to attract the right institution on the table. To come back in Nigeria, someone was asking the question earlier to Aime, how does blended finance works in the power sector? And she mentioned how IFC has been doing some work with some solar company. If you remember, in 2016, the Nigerian government approved about 16 IPPs, companies to create about 1,000 megawatts in terms of energy generation. However, none of them reached financial close. And the reason is there was actually a need of having early stage financing, as was mentioned earlier, but even that it was not enough affordable for the companies. So working with the Green Climate Fund, which is a UN which is an institution created by UN, we actually put together about a 200 million program with ADB, which is eligible to those 16 IPPs. Obviously, there is specific criteria, but at least if they can show they can meet that, they can have to cheaper access funding and hopefully be able to operate.
Thank you, Alice. And I think from what I'm hearing, you gave examples from the infrastructure space, which are totally different from the examples Jennifer gave. So where we didn't have sufficient traffic volumes, the government was able to step in and partner and say, you know what, I would de-risk that and underwrite any gaps that you have to make. So that was government's contribution and participation in the whole process as well. Okay, so let me come to my demand side gentlemen here, and let's take the conversation a little bit further. How prepared are Nigerian organizations for blended finance and blended financing?
Really good question. I think there are three things that we see companies having to contend with. The first is the reality that blended finance oftentimes can't be viewed as a permanent source of capital. And so enterprises have to position themselves and exhibit an ability to transition to more sustainable sources of capital. I like to think about blended finance as a ramp. In some cases, as the gentleman from Max might speak more about as well. The second thing that we find is enterprises are oftentimes not prepared to raise financing, but the beauty of blended finance is there are certain mechanisms like technical support mechanisms that can help enterprises prepare for accessing financing through these types of blended financing schemes. And I think the third thing I would like to mention is the difficulty of measuring the impact outcomes, which oftentimes requires a buildup of internal capacity that doesn't come naturally to a social enterprise or a startup for that matter. And so this is something that companies have to be very pragmatic about and decide and figure out their stage of readiness and then identify how they plug the gaps to be able to shore up their measuring capabilities.
Kola put it very well. Blended finance is adequate to help you ramp up, right? If I take an example, one of the reasons why I'm here, why I'm the CFO of Max, is because Max was able to get access to grant funding from the Shell Foundation, for example, over a period of years. And one of the specific grants was one of the outcomes of the grant was to build sort of like internal financial capabilities within the business. Right? As I mentioned earlier, part of what we're doing is unlocking finance for our for the space for our driver. Right? You cannot do that. You cannot effectively deliver on that mission if you don't have finance specialists within the business. It's as simple as that, right? So as much as you go out and want to raise capital to execute on that mission, you won't be successful if you aren't able to demonstrate that you can mitigate the risks that come from playing in that space. One of the ways you mitigate those risks is by having the internal capabilities, right? So it's really, to the initial question, which is, are Nigerian organizations prepared to raise blended finance? It's a bit of yes and no, right? The capabilities you typically will require to be ready, blend finance will assist you in building them in-house. So what you have to do is you have to engage. So a lot of what we do, for example, is we constantly engage with investors, whether commercial investors, whether impact investors, whether grant funders and so on and so forth. We engage permanently to understand their sort of like their risk return profiles, their requirements, their objectives, and so on and so forth. In doing so, we learn about, how to be successful, and then we implement. And that's how we're able to sort of like, gradually and continuously increase our fundraising capabilities. So it's not, from the standpoint of an investing company, this is always something I'm going to try to speak from. It can be very academic to think about it in terms of, what I need to do to be ready. How you get ready is by engaging. Just go out and engage. Just bust door open. Talk to, blow up people's phone, blow up people's emails. They'll respond eventually. There's no, the worst that can happen is they'll say no, right? There's no end. Just engage, right? That's what I can say.
Okay, thank you, Max. So I think that again, let's also bring it into context, right? What type of envelope size is suitable for blended finance? Because in your case, infrastructure projects, they're not small projects in that sense. Jennifer, in opening up markets, what should we be thinking about when we're looking at an envelope size?
It's a great question. We see a huge range. And just, I think there's two different types of blended finance transactions that you highlighted, project-based and fund intermediary-based, and then even directly into businesses. So we call them all blended finance, but they look very different. And indeed, infrastructure projects can be quite large, affordable housing, bridges, toll roads, et cetera. To a business, it can be much more right-sized, and it can scale over time. So maybe the first blended finance investment in that business is $250 and then it scales to $500 million. And then for a fund, what we see on average, or an intermediary that's then on lending or on investing to businesses and projects, it can be anywhere from $15 million up to a couple $100 million. So they come in all shapes and sizes. But one thing, just to connect the last comments you made, is that engagement. On the other side, for the supply side, what it's creating is education. A lot of the private investors that are trying to engage their money in these different types of blended finance transactions really have education gaps. They don't either understand the business models or the environment that an entrepreneur could be working in, although they very much understand there's a need. And that engagement, what it's actually doing on this side is enormous amount of education. And I have found it takes, you would think 1 or 2 times and you'd be there. It takes more like 5 to 6 times for an investor to begin to put the puzzle pieces together, to understand a business model, to understand the market that they're operating in, to understand where the financing gaps are, to understand how their capital can play a role, how to understand how their capital with others can play a role. And so I really resonated with your comments about engaging, because it's doing something very different on either side of that engagement, but it's like a very necessary dance.
Great. Alice?
So just to, actually, Sub-Saharan Africa is the largest receiver of blended finance, although it has been on declining basis. Like I think in 2010 it was about 47%, and I think in 2018 it was about 30 or 37%. And we're actually losing that capital in the benefits of other emerging countries like in Asia, India, and China. And one of the reasons is what she just mentioned, is also the sizable business available to attract those kind of blended financing capital. So one of the things that can be done, although in terms of size, you can see from $10,000 to $100,000, or if you go to infrastructure space, you can go actually up to $100 million as well type of transaction. For an investor or an entrepreneurial perspective, is really trying to have access actually to all the available facilities in the market that the person is operating in, because you find all sorts of stakeholders. You find stakeholders provide grants. You find stakeholders that provide technical assistance, like for example, the Agriculture Capital Fund. You find stakeholders like the Africa Risk Capital Insurance, which is provided by the African Union, which, for example, provide the kind of insurance you will need for natural disaster, which is something that tends to affect farmers, especially in the dry season as well, in northern Nigeria, and in places like Mali and the Sahel area. So I think what actually stakeholders need to do, or maybe from a government perspective, because the government usually is the one that consolidates all the stakeholders, is to try to find ways to make that information available for the people who need it, because there is quite innovative instruments in the market, but sometimes, as she mentioned, the private sectors, especially the small size holders, they don't have access to it, they're just not aware. And even they are aware, they don't know how to use them. So I think there's a lot of skills and knowledge work that has to be done to actually allow blended finance being used in African capital market, and especially in Nigeria.
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe that's something the foundation can actually do in terms of providing that knowledge base for people. But I think, again, one thing I've heard is that there's a lot of engagement required, and that engagement is a two-way learning street. You're learning about the business model, the opportunities, and they're also learning about your own risk appetite and portfolios and how to structure and package the whole thing. But before I go back to them, about what's the average size of a deal? Average duration of a deal. Duration of a deal, because sometimes it's not is it a 3-month engagement? Is it a 1 year? Is it 2 years? In the case of the bridge, you said it was 20 years. Yes, exactly. So what's the average duration?
Alice, would you like to?
Sure. Okay. And I want to think is probably, even for the smaller sectors, it probably is the same thing. At a minimum, you probably need like 3 years. So from the moment you have the idea, it becomes a concept note, you find the right studies around it, or you need to actually conduct the technical studies, the market studies, to be able to make the business case and actually approach financial institution. And most of the time, those are also costs. There's a cost implication on that. And also, there is availability of data in the market you want to know. You want to invest in. Those stages can take you up to 3 years, and if you add now the permits or the licenses that you need to operate, that's also another year that you can think about. So before you actually even to get to a point that you start building what you need to build, or you start even putting the structure in place that you need, the physical structure you need, it can take up to 3 years. For an infrastructure project, is actually also around the same years, and it can take longer if it's for example a new market, if it's a small economy, and there's some sort of perceived risk in that sector or in that particular project that need to be mitigated. So it's really it takes time, and the problem that you tend to find is there's no enough capital for that stage, because you're losing money basically. So that's where blended finance can come in, because you have institutions like the World Bank, IFC, Africa Finance Corporation, or even actually NGOs at the smaller levels that can actually provide those first loss grants to allow small companies to get up and run.
So since you've talked about data, just a minute, Jen, let me come back here. Yesterday in the inauguration of the Presidential Economic Advisory Committee, President Buhari did say that Nigeria is too reliant on IMF and World Bank and external data sources, right? But gentlemen, how do we and how do our markets get access to data for this preliminary work? Because they're not just going to walk and knock on doors and say, oh, I need money because I have a good movie I want to produce in the creative industry or something or the other. How do they get access to this? Because Jen has said it has to be a market that can scale. So how do we begin to do this preliminary work and get the right foundations?
That's a really tough one, and I think this is one role that blended finance or these instruments can help enable, particularly when you think about the value of innovations that are more market creating and that allow entrepreneurs go out and innovate to shore in folks that are ordinarily not consuming goods and services. I think the ability for the capital to support more MVP and experimentation is needed in markets like this where you don't have primary data. So yeah, that's.
Okay, so for those of you who don't understand what Kola meant by MVP, it's
a minimum viable product.
Thank you. Right, Guy.
Not the most valuable player. You have to generate your own data. Let's be real. Okay, there's no data. I mean, there's no. There's no data out there. There's no like you can't go on Bloomberg or on Thomson Reuters and get the data. It won't happen. So you have to generate your own data. That's again, I'll take our example. That's what we do. You have to know everything about your business and forget the investors. Sorry to say that, right? So forget them. It's for you. Like even to make your decisions about your own business, you need that data, right? You need to know. How much, what is the average, length of a trip, right? How much is the average value of a trip? How much is the average daily income of a driver? Like, you have to track those metrics for yourself, first and foremost. And then you'll find out that, like when you actually do back to the engagement, start talking to the investors, all of a sudden you'll have the answers to most of the questions they'll be asking you. Not because, and so it's more organic than just thinking to yourself, what sort of like data framework should I build? Should I build before I go and talk to IFC or AFC or whoever else? It has to be about, okay, what sort of data framework should I have to understand my business intrinsically and be able to make decisions and improve it and grow it, right? And then, so when you now have those parallel conversations, there's, the likelihood of like being thrown a curveball that you can't handle is minimized, right? Then from your own data, you can now sort of like extrapolate on sort of like the market data. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I mean, there isn't also an absolute dearth of data. There are bodies like, and let's give credit where credit is due, right? There are organizations such as, for example, the statistics office, where they have, they have enough macro data, they have a decent amount, let's say, of macro data that can help businesses sort of like test hypothesis, right? You can at least test a hypothesis. And then, you test your hypothesis. In testing it, you generate additional data that sort of like either corroborates the macro data or contradicts it, right? But yeah, like, it's to say that there's no data is okay, it's the case. It may or may not be the case, but that should not stop us from pressing ahead.
Question. Hello? Yeah. Just to go back to your original where you started this, this is part of the dance. When we can see the data, then we can structure the blended finance vehicle to meet the market need, not the investor demand. Because that's where the gaps are right now we see, is there's finance products in the market, but they're not structured to really meet the business model that's being presented from the community. And the beauty of blended finance is once we can see that data, once we can understand that model, is to build a blended finance vehicle that can set that business up for success. In the world of debt, that means creating payments that match when the cash flows come out of the business. simple things, but really important. And that does take creativity, which Emma mentioned before. That takes some innovation, because you need to slow down and not just take a product that's off the shelf from the bank and put it in. You have to think about that business, what kind of revenue they're making, when they're making that revenue, and how they can repay you and still feed their business to grow and scale.
Just on the topic of metrics, we find in our portfolio that the companies that are able to access financing are obsessed with tracking metrics, and they're tracking everything, and so for all the entrepreneurs in the house, before you start that dance, ensure that you are tracking all your metrics, the ones that you think matter today and the ones that may not matter today, because that's what really helps you engage with financiers that can customize products for your business.
Okay, so basically there's no cookie cutter approach to this whole process. It's about, we don't have data, that's the glass is half full or half empty. But take what you have, use proxies that are available, and begin to generate the insights that you need. But I think what I want to hold on to here is what Guy said. Don't do it for the third parties. Do it for your own business, because that's the sustainability drive. That's what's going to keep it sustainable. And blended finance is only an entry financing mechanism. So you're still going to have to go back for additional funding. So don't think that, oh, I got this piece, I'm done. You're going to go back for additional funding, and it's going to be more difficult to get additional funding if you haven't done a lot of these things precedent to. Finally, before I open up to the audience, let's talk about impact. Because I think that, yes, we glossed over it, we talk about it, because don't forget that we're all here to talk about 17 goals, right? Some of them are more pertinent in our environment here, but how do we begin to sort of tangibly look at impact? So Guy, in your case, you're working with mobility. You're working with mobility, you're working with people who are drivers in general. How do you measure impact in your business?
Great question. So based on our mission, we measure the impact we deliver in many different ways, right? We measure it through the amount of capital that we unlock, right? We unlock it not for ourselves, we unlock it for them, right? And it's capital that typically they would not have access to. So that has a significant impact on their lives, right? We measure the number of direct jobs we create, right? Because, I mean, we operate in an industry which is overwhelmingly informal, right? So, I mean, in terms of, if you think of numbers, like, depending on the estimates, the estimates are about, 600,000 informal Okada drivers in Lagos, for example, right? When you think of all of the formal operators on aggregate, it's less than 10,000, and I'm being generous. So there is significant room for growth. So every single person that you put on top of an Okada, right, or inside a keke, is a new job you have created, is a new formal form of employment you've created, right? We measure, for instance, I mentioned it earlier, the average daily income they generate, right? To compare it to, so what they would get in the informal space. Now you ask me, how do we know what they get in the informal space, right? Because we go out and we get the data. Like we send people out to, like, we go and ride Okada ourselves, right? And we can count. Okay, this guy typically will take this number of trips per day, and we can sort of like reverse engineer how much revenue that informal guy has made compared to the revenue of our own guy, and see, all right, you know what? How much more revenue have we generated for the formal operator? Because we provide them with insurance services, right? And because we track, safety, because we keep data on a safety record on accidents and fatalities and such metrics. That's also data that that's impact data, right? How much less fatalities have we generated, or like how many lives have we saved, rather, right? So, for example, we know based on, again, by triangulating various data sources, that fatalities are very high in our sector. An average of, not in our company, in our sector generally, an average of 1 every 20 minutes, which is horrendous, right? So we we make it a mission to have zero fatality, for example. So we know, okay, you know what? Every 20 minutes we've saved an additional life, and we've had zero fatality, for example. We track indirect jobs, right? Because every driver, right, generates employment around him and his community. He generates employment for his spouse, for example. So we have noticed that our drivers very often, after having been on our platform for a number of months, are able to sort of like sell their bikes in the secondary market, and with that money, because we interview them, they'll go and open a side business for their wives, right? For example, we have the case of a driver who was able to send his children to university, right? So we measure, for example, education. So like education prevalence, literacy. So there's many, the impacts comes in various forms. So access to finance, access to income, access to a social support system, ESG metrics. We've put together an ESG framework. So you have to be, again, it goes back to the point I made earlier, right? You have to be deliberate about, okay, what is important? What will enable us as a business to understand our operating environment better, and therefore continue to build product, services, solutions to continue solving those problems. Yeah.
Okay, great. Kola?
I think that's quite exhaustive,
okay.
But if I would just add anything, what it showed is how deliberate you have to be, and how much of a job this really is for the companies. But I think more so is the measuring for our companies before they do it for financiers, they must do it for themselves, because metrics are really how you get to know what's working and not working within your business. So I wouldn't add any more.